Yeah, so not gonna lie, I didn't actually plan to make this video initially. I thought having a top 10 list for Amphibia episodes was good enough for a 5,000 subscriber special. Thank you guys so much for helping us reach that milestone, by the way. But I guess it's not special enough because we got to do the same thing for the Owl House, which makes sense given many of you found this channel because of it. So here is my overdue list of my top 10 favorite episodes of the Owl House. Again, if you want to show your personal list, leave it in the comments, but here's my take on it all. Starting at number 10, we have Hunting Talisman. So this episode is on this list for primarily showing us the Golden Guard, or Hunter, in his more authentic form. Initially introduced in the first episode of Season 2, the Golden Guard showed himself off as being authoritative and rather powerful, but even then you can easily tell he is a child with insecurities. And well, that is exactly what we got in this episode. But we also learned quite a lot about Hunter as well, specifically about his worldview at the time. While we may disagree with him, we can at least understand him and sympathize him, which is quintessential fuel for his redemption. And that is exactly how it turned out. On the more lighthearted side of things, I really enjoyed the dynamic between Luz and Hunter in this episode. Many people I know tend to describe them as siblings because of this, and yeah, as someone with an older sibling, I can really see it. And I'm happy to see the crew lean into this dynamic later in the show. Finally, one other thing I appreciate with this episode is how we got to explore Latissa, which is pretty much the only other major town we see in the Boiling Isles aside from Bonesborough. Frankly, I wish we got to see more of it outside of this episode and the last few episodes of Season 2, but given the time constraints the crew had, I can't really blame them for that. Overall, Hunting Talisman is a great episode for formally showing Hunter for the first time, and contributing to the world building of the show. Next at number 9 on the list, there is Elsewhere and Elsewhere. So I don't know about you guys, but I actually really enjoy stories that involve time travel. It may be a rather cliched trope in fiction, but when executed correctly, it can be very cool to see, and that's what the Owl House pulled off in my opinion. Granted, I am aware that it's a form of time travel that is very similar to Harry Potter's version of it. For those who aren't aware of Harry Potter, essentially, the characters in the present were destined to go back in the past and cause the events at the time to happen. In my opinion, that is the form of time travel that makes the most logical sense, since we don't have to worry about mind-f***ing time paradoxes, alternate timelines and such. Granted, this form of time travel does raise a question about free will. Could Luz actually avoid all the terrible events that happened in the show if she chose not to travel back and help Philip? Or was she really destined to meet and help Philip and cause the chain reaction of terribleness under Bellis' rule? I tend to believe the latter, but feel free to comment below what you think regarding this question. Aside from the time traveling aspect, it's also great to see further backstory on Philip/Bellows and the Collector. It was episodes like this that really make me appreciate the Owl House a lot more, particularly when it comes to building up their main villains, which I consistently said was the show's greatest strength. Because of that, it deserves a spot on my list. Moving on to number 8, we have Enchanting Grom Fright. So there's quite a lot that we see in this episode from a plot development standpoint and a character development standpoint. For plot development, we learned that Luz has some sort of doppelganger who was taking her place in the human realm during her absence. Now of course, we later learned this Luz doppelganger is actually harmless and actually rather sweet. But at the time, many people in the Owl House community were creating theories of how they were nefarious and was trying to do harm against Luz and Camila. Honestly, the Owl House community theories back then were rather crazy looking back in hindsight. Be sure to subscribe when I inevitably make a video on that. Aside from that plot point, we also get to see further character development into Luz and Amity and their greatest fears. From this, we get one of the greatest scenes in this show. Yeah, this scene alone is actually why the episode's in number 8. The animation of it is just excellent, and the music was some of the best I've heard in any show. It was just so impactful for not only alluding to Lumity eventually becoming canon, but also for making the Owl House as popular as it is. Next at number 7, there is Knock Knock Knockin' on Hootie's Door. So one thing I really appreciate about this episode is how it makes Hootie the most important character of the show for once. With Hootie being the chaotic freak of nature he is, you would expect this episode to be very chaotic too, which is exactly what we got, and I enjoyed for that. In the process of trying to help out Luz, Ida, and King, he screwed them over heavily, which in turn allowed them to discover a part of themselves and grow. thus actually helping them. Only in a Hootie episode does that kind of plotline actually make sense when you watch it. When it comes to more specific things that I like, it's great to see further clues to what King is, the origins of Ida's curse, and Luz and Amity finally ask each other out, thus satisfying all the Lumity shippers in the fandom. Overall, this episode has pretty much a little bit of everything. It's got good character development, great lore development, and nice teasers for what's next in the series. The episode even had surprisingly memorable comedic moments too, which is impressive for a show that is generally more serious than the usual Disney cartoon.
Don't you talk about my mother!
When an episode like this basically ticks all the boxes to satisfy pretty much everyone who watches the show closely, then it definitely deserves a spot on my list. Next at number 6, there is Agony of a Witch. This episode is here mainly because it was the episode that changed how I viewed the Owl House as a whole. For a lot of Season 1, I kind of viewed things similar to how I viewed Amphibia Season 1. The Owl House had quite a bit of unsettling visuals and can get rather serious. But for the most part, the episodes were very Disney-esque, as in rather fun and enjoyable to watch. But Agony of the Witch changed all that. Here, Ida and Luz's life were really in danger, and by the end of the episode, Ida really did try to sacrifice herself to save Luz, which goes a long way to show how far their relationship has evolved in one season. For a moment, we were led to believe that Ida, as we knew her, is gone, and that really left everyone in the show and people watching in an emotional mess. Now, it is worth noting that other shows like Amphibia had similar episodes like this, but one thing the Owl House did great here is how the tone of the show really changed after this episode. After Agony of the Witch, Luz was obviously traumatized, and her actions reflect that. Also, she, Ida, King, and everyone else involved had to live with the long-term consequences of it, which made Agony of the Witch one of the most consequential episodes of the series. For that alone, it deserves to be at least number 6 on this list. At number 5, we have King's Tide. So this episode was very much a roller coaster of emotions. At some moments, it can give you a little bit of relief, but then the very next moment, it can pull on your heart and give you emotional damage. It's kind of like what Amphibia did with True Colors, which makes a lot of sense given that both episodes were the season 2 finales of their respective shows. Although surprisingly, I'm willing to say this episode was darker overall compared to True Colors. It may not have the sudden shock moments, but it was more tonally consistent. In other words, King's Tide really was the Owl House leaning into its dark and serious nature, which I have a lot of respect for. Even though dark and serious stories aren't exactly my cup of tea most of the time, when a show embraces it, I do usually appreciate it, which was the case here. I mean, seeing Luz nearly die, Ida losing her arm, and King sacrificing himself to save Luz and all of her friends, all of that can leave scars to a character, figuratively and literally. As a result of those scenes, Luz's reunion with her mom really felt very bittersweet at least. Actually, it's more just sad because Luz finally makes it home, but it came at the cost of nearly everything she loves getting destroyed right in front of her. Yeah, overall, King's Tide was just dark, serious, and rather sad by the end of it, which is how a season finale should be because it leaves me and the audience wanting more. However, as dark and serious King's Tide was, the Owl House has gone further in another episode. But before we get to that, let's go to number 4 on the list, which is Eclipse Link. This episode is definitely more lighthearted compared to King's Tide. In fact, I'm willing to say it's one of the more lighthearted episodes of the show.
This looks ancient.
What? No, it's only 30 years old. I remember seeing this in theaters.
Yes, you're old. Who cares? We have a crisis on our hands.
Did I do it? Did I go into Harpy mode?
No, you just screamed hoot and ran headfirst into a wall of ice. Pretty funny, actually.
Little mouse, owl house, frilly blouse, boop. Huh? I feel great. I wonder if this is permanent.
Aside from those comedic moments, of course, we also got some rather important lore development regarding the source of magic in the Boiling Isles, which makes it one of the more consequential episodes of the series. We also got some needed character development between Amity and Hunter. Honestly, I feel like these two characters should have interacted with each other a lot more given their personalities and relationships with Luz. Again, blame the corporate mouse for that, I guess. But by far, what I like most about this episode is the fight scene between these two characters. Seriously, the animation to the music really made this moment very impactful. Honestly, whenever an episode gets an animation quality boost, there's a really good chance it will be one of my favorites. Speaking of which, that leads me to number 3 on the list, which is Thanks to Them. Despite Disney screwing over the show, that did not stop the few Season 3 episodes that we did get from being phenomenal. Well, at least 2 of them were. We'll get to that one shortly, but yeah, there are a few reasons why Thanks to Them ranks rather high on this list. Well, one, like I mentioned earlier, it has some really good animated scenes that I can't help but praise. The crew may have gotten their timetable of creating Season 3 screwed up, but that didn't stop them from making banger moments like this fight scene between the Hexite Squad and Bellows. Massive props to the animation team here. Aside from the visuals of this episode, it surprisingly did a great job being an overall lighthearted episode, while also pushing the dark, depressing aspects of the show. Wait, that sounds a bit confusing. How did they do that? Well, for most of this episode, we do see the Hexite Squad actually enjoy their time together in the human realm despite their home being in a state of uncertainty. As a result of that, we did get some rather great fun moments because I feared it was these kinds of moments that the crew would cut out to make room for important plot development. Now, admittingly, considering how the other specials went, maybe it would have been great to have more plot development too, but I am glad that the crew was able to put in these funnier moments to lighten the mood. Mostly. However, while the Hexite gang were relatively having a fun time, Luz on the other hand was mired with guilt throughout this episode, which really goes to show just how much trauma has affected her. As a result, this episode was ironically also one of the darkest in this series.
They'd know that their lives would never have been in danger if it weren't for him. They should hate his guts, and it would be better if he literally never existed.
And the darkness was further pushed by the fact that this was the show's only Halloween special. So of course, it has to be spooky. But one thing I do like a lot is how when the show got spooky, it was doing it with purpose. Normally, whenever a show gets spooky for Halloween special, it's usually not canon to the actual show. But with the Owl House, it's spooky because it really is a painfully important moment in the overarching story. Speaking of pain, Hunter was just brutally tortured in this episode, especially in the second half when Bellows possessed him and, well, did this.
Goodbye, Evelyn.
Yeah, while Flapjack's death wasn't that surprising, it was still emotional in its own right. I can go on and on explaining what I really enjoyed about this episode, but annoyingly, YouTube actually blocked it for whatever reason. So for now, that is all I have to say about Thanks to Them. Next, at number 2 on the list, is Watching and Dreaming. So this being the series finale of the Owl House, I was nearly certain that it would be on this list. Particularly because you can really tell that the crew did everything they could with whatever screen time they had left. And man, did it pay off a lot. Within 55 minutes, the show gave further backstory to the collector's past, had them go through a redemption arc, prove yet another popular theory of Bellows possessing the Boiling Isles Titan, show Luz save the collector and die in the process, only to be brought back to life by Papa Titan himself. As a result, we finally got to see Luz fully powered up like her Disney protagonist counterparts. And despite the very limited time frame, we also managed to see the show actually wrap up a lot of loose ends, like more so than I expected. I also really appreciated the massive boost in the animation quality, as well as the music in these scenes. Even though the basis of the climax of this episode was pretty much just Luz pulling Bellows away from the Titan Heart, everything else in the scene, from Luz's callback to episode 1, to her family and friends, helping her save everyone in the Boiling Isles, all of that elevated the scene to feel a lot more intense.
Now eat this, sucker!
Then of course, the cherry on top of it all is how they ended Bellows' story, which is to be killed off, being the sad, irredeemable piece of shit he is.
Well, we ain't.
That was extremely satisfying.
I can go on explaining what I liked from this episode, and if you want to hear more of my thoughts on it, you can check out my video on Watching and Dreaming here. Overall, the crew did a phenomenal job concluding the Owl House in the way they wanted. And given the show's themes and the limitations Disney put on the crew, It's hard to find anything that they could have reasonably improved on, in my opinion. Still, as much as I really enjoyed this episode, it's surprisingly not my favorite. That title for my number 1 favorite episode of The Owl House goes to Hollow Mind. So when it comes to shows, there are a few ways for it to really impress me and have me raving about it. Either the show is just funny and it embraces that, or the show starts out funny and then shocks you by going dark. Another way is for the show to start out somewhat dark and mildly disturbing, and it just embraces it and pushes the darkness as much as possible. The Owl House did that third option, and Hollow Mind was the best example of that in my opinion. In this episode, we finally learn about Belos' backstory in his years before becoming Emperor and what he was like to previous Golden Guards. Yeah, I don't know about you, but I got chills when I saw that. Also, seeing confirmation that Luz was partly the reason how Belos accumulated the amount of power he has was quite an emotional scene as she breaks down trying to process that fact. Belos' character development was pretty much my favorite aspect of this show. In a time where new Disney stories usually involve villains that are antagonistic, but not necessarily evil, it's quite refreshing to see a villain that is unequivocally evil and irredeemable to being so stuck in their own twisted ideology. But what really sealed this episode for me was the ending. That whole ordeal actually left Luz and Hunter emotionally scarred, and it had a significant impact in their decision making for the rest of the series, which is something I can't confidently say with other shows that had similar episodes. It really represents all the greatest attributes of the show in my opinion. Therefore, it's my favorite episode of The Owl House. So those are my top 10 episodes of the series. Do you agree with my rankings, or is your list different? Write down your top 10 favorite episodes in the comments below, and please give this video a like and subscribe for more content like this. Also, thanks again to Seb Maida and MB Command Nerd for supporting this channel directly through Patreon, and thank you all for watching this video. I hope you all have a great day. See you in the next one.